Hi, my name's Dr. Greg Pearson. I'm a psychiatrist in private practice with an interest in mood disorders and addictive disorders.
And I'm Dr. Matt McDornan. I'm an adult psychiatrist in private practice as well. And today we're going to have a discussion about the vexed and vexing question of personality, a very broad-ranging topic from our discipline, and one that is curious and informed by lots of different thinkers over the years.
And Matt, the relevance of that is that when an individual becomes depressed, they rarely become depressed in isolation. And as a result of that, what we see is great variation in the way illness affects an individual. There's a lovely old saying a mentor of mine used to have, and that was, illnesses are easy to treat, but people are difficult. And that's referring to the notion that depending on someone's personality or character style, their response to these events is going to be quite varied. So your question about personality is such an important one. Essentially, personality relates to enduring, so very long-standing, very predictable ways that people respond in response to life events, interpersonal issues as well.
That's right, that's been emphasised, hasn't it? That it's really the interpersonal style that's the cornerstone.
Yeah.
But I guess the other aspect is its enduring ways of feeling and thinking and behaving.
Yeah, absolutely.
Within that and behind that interpersonal style.
Enduring and predictable. And so not all of the ways that we respond to life events are helpful. And for some people, these fixed and enduring ways of responding interpersonally, responding internally, are fixed in a dysfunctional way.
So now you're talking about personality disorders,
that's
Greg.
when we move into the realm of personality disorders.
This is a curious and long-standing historical inquiry too, isn't it? So I wondered whether we could maybe begin by going back in time and having a think about some of the key thinkers along the way.
Absolutely. Where would you like to start?
Well, I think we'd have to start with Sigmund Freud and the whole psychoanalytical theories. And as curious as they are, it's the starting point. So just to remind listeners, some of these ideas are different and assume certain things and axioms, but Sigmund Freud's main concept was the interaction of an id, or an unconscious series of drives, and a conscience-like agency he called the superego, the external world, and a negotiating figure, really, the ego itself. And the different kinds of interplays with this determined somewhat personality. That was one of his versions.
Yes, absolutely, Matt.
Another version was that through development, these different drives resided in different parts of our body. So it does sound odd, but he had all sorts of oral and anal and phallic and genital and latency stages, and some of that still persists in sort of pop culture, I suppose, when you hear people refer to someone being a bit anal in reference to their obsessionality or stubbornness, and that's something that's sort of hung over from his thinking.
Yeah, and you know, that has another historical element to it as well, which I think it might be important for the listeners to know, because that sort of sexualised notion of instinctive drive and erotic attachment actually emerged from the time that he was working with Charcot in the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris.
Yes.
And he discovered, Charcot was a famous neurologist, and they had on the ward at any one particular time people who had neurological deficits, but in fact no lesion, as Charcot referred to, in terms of no predictable dysfunction that they could demonstrate neurologically. And ultimately Freud was able to elicit from this that these people had a history of sexual trauma. And in fact his first publication, I believe, in the European Science Academy was about sexual trauma, and it was almost
Taboo.
it was completely taboo, and his career was nearly over.
Yeah.
So that was then reformulated into a theoretical model
Yes.
that underpinned those basic drives. And it's curious that here we are today, you know, faced really with the very obvious consequences still of sexual trauma, which appears to have been ingrained in some areas of humanity for a prolonged period of time.
Right. I think with the historical note, you know, Sigmund Freud was ground zero, and from that came all sorts of thinkers, and there's like a lot of areas of sciences and philosophy, there's a family tree of thinkers. So some of the people that followed on from him were Carl Jung, who people will be aware of, who talked about archetypes and group unconscious processes, and Erik Erikson, who really made it very operational, the idea of challenges to someone as they progress through a life stage.
And I still find that a really useful
Me too.
way to formulate someone's difficulties at a particular stage of their life. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about Erikson and those developmental stages.
Erikson was an American who really came up with 8 different challenges, and the growing human had to negotiate these successfully. So, you know, the first one was basic trust versus mistrust. You need to be able to trust the primary caregivers, and if that's in some way distorted, it remains a fixation point that people can return to under pressure. And these all went through during stages of life. So identity through, you know, non-form of identity, or generativity through stagnation, so having family or not. And so he had these different things. Some of them were quite culturally biased, of course, but it's a useful way to look at the different challenges that humans face in their growth, and what happens if you don't successfully negotiate one of these stages.
Exactly. So, yeah, these are sort of stages of psychological challenge that you meet at a certain stage of your life and graduate from, and then face the next challenge. And having not been able to rectify those, then there is a vulnerability to that dynamic later in life. And it's a really helpful way to conceptualise.
It is helpful for us, but of course people wanted to be able to test these theories. And so there were certain people who held them up to criticism. And I guess as a response to that, the whole behaviouralist movement came about.
Absolutely.
So people like B.F. Skinner, who really sort of took up the idea of John Locke, that we're tabula rasa, or a blank, that the world is projected onto us. And so really looking at the biological systems around behaviour and so on, and leaving out the thinking bit for a while. It was useful to clarify some things, but it didn't quite capture personality, did it?
No, that's right. I mean, behaviourism is about behaviour and about learned and compulsive behaviour. And still it's really helpful, I find, as a psychiatrist, inviting someone to try and put their behaviour in context and to determine what the outcome of that behaviour may be for them psychologically. And we will talk later about behavioural activation as one of the arms of treating depression. But the interesting thing about that is it is one of the arms, and I think this is one of the deficiencies of behaviourism, is that it related just to one element.
That's right. It was too reductionist.
Too reductionist, yeah.
I think one of the most fascinating developments in trying to understand personality is the story of Allport, an American psychologist. And there's a famous story that Gordon Allport, as a young clinician, went and got to visit Freud in Vienna. And he was a bit nervous, and to break the ice, he told Freud this story, that on the train in the carriage there was a young boy who wouldn't sit down because he was very fearful of becoming dirty. And Freud said to him after a minute, "Was that little boy you?" And Gordon Allport said, "No, I'm just telling you a story." And from that he was able to go back and think, you know, this whole kind of thing about the unconscious and always referring to the past, it might not be the way to advance the field. And from that, he really developed this notion of trait-based inquiry about personality. And the process was interesting. He really had a lexicon-like way of approaching it, where he went away and found thousands of words that might decide what personality is, and then measured that with people, and then came down to looking at the way that these descriptions of ourselves cluster together.
And this is the famous ocean.
It's all come from that, Greg, yes. Yeah, so what Greg's referring to is a very well-tested way of looking at different parameters, really, of how we describe ourselves. Yeah.
And just before we move on to that, Matt, it would be worth again illustrating that one of Freud's great contributions to psychiatry was the notion of unconscious responses and behaviour. And it's funny because when you were telling the story about Alport, I immediately recalled my conversation with our dearly but departed colleague, Dr. Alston Unwin, when I clearly made an unconscious error, which was hilarious to all of us.
Yeah.
And I won't reveal it on camera, but it is important to know that the unconscious still is a valuable way of understanding behaviour that may not necessarily be predictable, but which carries a huge amount of meaning in certain contexts.
Yes, and I don't think any of these ways of thinking of personality ever dismiss the notion that there's forces at play beyond our language or reflection.
And these forces relate to experiences early in life.
Yes.
And those forces, or those experiences perhaps, which carry the most meaning and valence, are forces that operate around attachment to significant others.
Absolutely. So I suppose the modern thinking of personality still resides in examining traits, but in the study of psychiatry, it's very much the pendulum swung towards neuroscience and in particular genetics and heritability, sometimes taking into account things like attachment and the early experiences. And the other great researcher that's, I guess, really developed this field is Robert Cloninger.
Yes, that's right. So his assertion that temperament and character are great contributors to personality, and that these are elements that are biological in origin.
Yes, that's right. He had this view that the varying aspects of temperament you were born with, and they were all independently related to genetics and underlying neurological structures, and our character is built on top of that as we move through life.
And the early studies on temperament I always found fascinating. You know, the notion that an infant would show temperamental characteristics that would then carry throughout the person's existence.
Yes.
And that there would be, for example, babies who naturally slept well and fed well and had what was referred to as good rhythmicity.
Yes.
That they found the rhythms of life easily.
Yes.
Their temperament would be much more easygoing than babies that were perhaps less prone to that and more anxious and irritable and slept poorly and fed poorly. And these are things that just carry through.
And thankfully there is a lot of overlap between the research in trait-based approaches, and there's lots of them now, and also the kind of predictive work of Robert Cloninger. It's always reassuring when different approaches start to converge. It means that there's probably something real there.
That's right. And so I guess putting that all together then, what we're saying is that we are born with certain temperamental characteristics. So these are basic ways of existing within ourselves emotionally.
Yes.
And that these form the platform to long-standing and enduring features of how we are in the world.
Yes. And I would say that there's one other large school, if you like, and that would be the humanist one. So it's people might be aware of Carl Rogers, who was a famous clinician and researcher from the States as well, who wanted to really look at the idea of your own personal experience of all these things. It's really based in phenomenology, and that is a European way of thinking about what we experience. So phenomena is really based on that Greek word, what shines forth. So it's really what meets us. So if you read a book, or if we went to the art gallery, Greg, you would appreciate different things.
Absolutely.
From the art, you'd be moved in a different way, and it's one of those absolutely human, incredibly hard to measure and decipher kind of phenomenological things that is also there. It's nested in all these other theories and so on, but it's a bit beyond our discussion today. But there is a you, there's a subjective you in there that is also this personality.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's an amalgam.
Absolutely.
Of biology, of attachment, of life experience, that develops the complex nature of an individual.
Yes. What about people often refer to the big diagnostic manual, DSM-5. They have a particular way of thinking about personality, don't they?
Yes, they do, and I would think most of the readers would have some familiarity with that. So DSM-5 clusters the personalities in 3 rough domains. It's cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. And cluster A refers to the very odd and eccentric character types. So these are schizoid, paranoid, and schizotypal. So these are people who tend to withdraw from social contact and are seen as eccentric and unusual and may be odd and suspicious. Then there's a cluster B of personality, which is the emotional and explosive and expressive type of personality. Perhaps best known is borderline personality, but also contained within their histrionic, narcissistic and antisocial. So these are people whose emotional world is powerful and sometimes overwhelming, and the expression of emotion is very pronounced. Then we have the anxious and avoidant personality types, the avoidant, the dependent and obsessive compulsive personalities who by nature again are a quieter group emotionally, but perhaps much more anxious and nervous than groups traditionally. And so yes, I still find that a reasonable way to conceptualise personality. And I guess from the perspective of DSM-5, their emphasis is really about making the diagnosis of a personality disorder. And I think that's worthy of a bit of discussion as well, because it's a very important concept and it's sometimes badly applied.
The thing about those descriptions are that they are descriptions. So they're again observations of how someone thinks and behaves, but there's no explanatory model offered.
Right.
So they're good at, I guess, recording this person's got this issue over time with various clinicians, but it doesn't tell us how they arrived in that spot. And that's really the role of a psychiatrist or a psychologist as they get to know someone, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To come up and really feed back to a person, how did this occur? Why is this occurring in a non-judgmental way? It's a pattern description and an attempt to try and link this up.
That's right, and the great deficiency in that model, and I think it's a pet hate that both you and I have, is where we meet someone who has a diagnosis of a personality disorder, usually borderline personality disorder, which traditionally is the end result of exposure to very complicated attachments in childhood, if not sexual abuse and neglect. And yet the person might present with absolutely no developmental history that suggests attachments have been disrupted to this degree.
Yes.
And so a diagnosis is made according to this cluster of presenting symptoms, but without putting it in context, it lacks meaning completely.
I think that's right. I think it's the difference between a snapshot and a long view of someone's development, which might happen through them talking or speaking to family members. And it's really what we began this discussion talking about, isn't it? I mean, how does mood colour what we think is personality? Where does your character and personality start and finish when it comes to someone being depressed? Because, as we pointed out, depression can be a very distorting and regressive state,
Yeah,
particularly if you're a fairly fragile figure.
Totally. And then we face the chicken and egg sort of dilemma. Is the depression a result of disordered character and therefore more amenable to psychological treatments around what promoted that character or caused that character disturbance? Or are we seeing a coarsening of personality, a more exaggerated form of personality caused by the influence of depression on the person? And that's a very, very difficult but very important area to explore.
Yes.
And for some people, the diagnosis of personality disorder is an incredibly helpful concept to have. It allows them to understand their relationship with themselves and with others in a meaningful way and get a sense of validation around
it's not a
the
moral
complexities of their...
It's not a moral judgment, is it?
No, not at all. And I just want to sort of warn the listeners a little bit. If you look up on the internet the DSM-5 personality disorders subtypes, when you read through these criteria, invariably you'll be picking out elements of yourself. And at the end of this, you might think, you've got a variety of very disordered behaviours. But the truth of the matter is that these are all elements of personality, and we all have personalities, so we're going to identify with elements of these descriptors quite strongly. The issue is, does it cause distress and dysfunction? Not do you identify with it, but are these elements of your character that are very rigid and long-standing and inflexible and hurtful to you and others? And if that's the case, then there may be elements of personality disorder.
That's right. It's a functional measure, isn't it?
Yep.
Even going back to Sigmund Freud, who we began with, I mean, his idea was if it impacts work, love and play, there's a problem. It doesn't really matter what you call it.
Absolutely, yes. So the manifestation of depression in all of you is going to vary greatly. There will be some very common threads that are important biological features of your depression, but what is going to be cast open is your response to the illness and the meaning that that illness carries for you at this stage of your life.
That's right. And we might go on at other points and talk about the varying personality disorders and their complex discussions for another time.
Yes. Well, thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you.